In the summer of the year 2000, Spider-Man hit the PlayStation 1 and kicked off a string of 3D Spider-Man games over the next 14 years. From 2000 to 2014, 12 unique Spider-Man games were released across 9 different consoles. Collectively, those games sold more than 25 million units across North America and Europe. I'm going to look at the statistics behind those sales to compare things across different consoles and geographic regions. And I'm also going to pay special attention to individual attach rates so that we can see on which console did Spider-Man have the most relative success. Is Spider-Man really a Sony guy? This analysis covers Spider-Man games from the PS1 to the Nintendo Wii, and accounting for all of the different console versions of each of the 12 unique Spider-Man games, there were a grand total of 35 releases. That's a lot of Spider-Man. On average, Spider-Man games have never been known for their high review scores. They've never set the critical world on fire. In fact, the average IGN score across those 35 releases is just a 6.8 out of 10. And if we look at average IGN scores for Spider-Man games across the various consoles, we see, with some notable exceptions, that most of the scores are indeed fairly low. Note the Dreamcast average score of 8.4. Sega's system, in fact, only had one Spider-Man game, and unfortunately due to incomplete sales data for that game, this will be the last mention of the Dreamcast in this analysis. Although average review scores are low, Spider-Man games are largely immune to lukewarm or even outright negative reviews, thanks to the power of the underlying property. Spider-Man is, essentially, a license to print money. This is evidenced by the fact that the average sales for those 35 releases was north of 700,000 units sold. That's a staggering average for a sample of that many games. Drilling down on this and looking at average sales of Spider-Man games across each console, you can clearly see that with the exception of the Wii, the web-slinger pulled either respectable, big, or massive average sales on pretty much every other platform. When we switch these numbers out to look at total Spider-Man sales by platform, it's the PlayStation 2 that's miles ahead. The PlayStation 1 is next, followed by a massive drop-off to get to everybody else. Now the 64 is hard to compare with only one Spider-Man release, but the Xbox, GameCube, 360, and PS3 are all fairly level in total sales. But what about sales by region? How did North American sales compare with European? Well, it turns out that North American gamers purchased more than double the amount of Spider-Man games than did their European counterparts. And if we move on to total regional sales by platform, we can get a good idea of just how that gap came to be. Spider-Man sales on the PlayStation 1 were nearly identical between the two regions. Sales on the 64 were heavily tilted towards North America, but those sales are minimal overall with just one Spider-Man game released on the 64. But the PlayStation 2 is where that gap opened up, with North American PlayStation 2 owners buying more than double the amount of Spider-Man games. And this is despite the fact that PS2 console sales were fairly evenly split between North America and Europe. Spider-Man sales on the Xbox, GameCube, and 360 were all heavily tilted towards North America, likely due to overall system sales being much higher in North America than in Europe for each of those hardware platforms. But Spider-Man came swinging back to Europe on the PlayStation 3, and again nearly tied North American sales. Finally, sales on the Wii were overwhelmingly tilted back towards North America. But besides the 64, the Wii was the smallest player in the Spider-Man game market. So what happens if we collapse all of these Spider-Man sales into 3 buckets? One for each of the big console manufacturers. Well, total Spider-Man sales on Nintendo and Microsoft platforms are both respectable, but sales on Sony systems are massive, with total sales of nearly 16 million units. And if we look at these differences by region, we see that Nintendo and Microsoft platforms are heavily staggered toward North American sales, while Sony platforms have a much more even split. The biggest selling Spider-Man game was the 2002 edition of Spider-Man the Movie on PlayStation 2, with North American sales of nearly 3 million and European sales of over 1.5 million, to put the game well over 4 million units sold. And in fact, if you combine the 3 console versions of that game, you get to nearly 7 million units sold for that particular edition of Spider-Man. That is jaw-droppingly huge. Not only is that an example of the potential selling power of a Spider-Man game, but it's the potential of a Spider-Man game when working in the wake of a Hollywood blockbuster that pulled in nearly $1 billion worldwide. Those are nice coattails to ride. But among all these numbers, there's something missing here: attach rates. An attach rate expresses the percent of system owners that own a given game. So while all of these numbers are incredibly valuable, attach rates give us that little bit of extra and more nuanced insight into the sales penetration that Spider-Man games managed on each system relative to hardware sales. And in the case of Spider-Man the Movie on PlayStation 2, the attach rate is 3.8%, meaning that nearly 4% of PlayStation 2 owners purchased Spider-Man the Movie. And though that might seem somewhat high, it actually doesn't even rank in the top 5 of Spider-Man game attach rates. The number 1 Spider-Man game by attach rate is the same game, but on GameCube, a game that had a nearly 7% attach rate. And if we look at average Spider-Man game attach rates by platform, some interesting numbers begin to emerge. Spider-Man games on the PlayStation 1 came in with a nearly 3% average attach rate, while on the 64 it was 2%, and on the PlayStation 2 a fairly low 1.4%. On the Xbox, Spider-Man games had a high 4% average attach rate, and on the GameCube an even higher 4.5%, while Spidey games on the 360, PS3, and Wii all came in with average attach rates of less than 1%. Gamers on those systems just didn't line up to buy Spider-Man games relative to the other games that were available. It's hard to read too much into these numbers because it's not just Spider-Man games driving these rates. Some systems have many more games to choose from, which will naturally drive down any rate. More choices mean less sales for any one given game. But still, it is accurate to say that relative to each console's install base, Spider-Man games had the most success on the GameCube. Something I honestly would have never predicted at the start of this analysis. Now moving on, and although not entirely appropriate to do, if we take an extra step and collapse these averages into overall averages for each of the 3 console manufacturers, it turns out that things are actually fairly even despite the disparities among individual consoles. Spider-Man games on Microsoft systems come in at a 2.3% average attach rate, and it's the same rate on Nintendo systems. But Spider-Man games come in a little lower on Sony systems with a 1.6% average attach rate. I do find it very interesting that the brand of system most closely associated with Spider-Man, especially today, has the lowest average attach rate. And it's for this reason that you could make a valid argument that Spider-Man really isn't just a Sony guy. But remember, the bigger a system's install base and game selection, the lower you can predict games' attach rates to be. Still, it is somewhat noteworthy. Either way, thanks for watching and stay tuned for more content in the coming weeks and months. I have a lot of irons in the fire and there's going to be lots of activity on this channel. Until next time, all the best and the sky's the limit.